All right, everybody, buckle up, because today we're going deep on a topic that's both fascinating and a little unnerving.
Oh, yeah. This one is a real head-scratcher.
We're talking about those companies, the ones that seem to be doing all the right things, listening to their customers, investing wisely, and yet they still end up on the wrong side of history.
Yeah, it's that paradox of good management potentially leading to spectacular failure. And that's precisely what we'll be unpacking today.
And to guide us on this journey, we're turning to a true business classic, a book that's practically a rite of passage for anyone in the corporate world.
That's right, we're cracking open The Innovator's Dilemma.
You know, I have to admit, the title alone, when I first heard it, I was like, okay, is this going to be another one of those business books that overpromises and underdelivers? But let me tell you, this book, it really does live up to the hype.
It really does. It gets right to the core of why some companies thrive in the face of change, while others, seemingly just as strong, crumble.
And a big part of that is this idea of disruptive technology, which isn't just about a product being slightly better or a bit faster.
Right, it's not about an incremental upgrade. We're talking about something that completely reshapes the landscape. Think game changers, not just rule tweakers.
Okay, so for our listeners who may not be familiar with the term, can you give us some example? Paint us a picture.
Sure, the book uses the evolution of computer disk drives, which, if you remember those old 14-inch behemoths.
Oh, yeah, I've seen pictures. Those things were massive.
Exactly. Yeah. Now, the companies that made those drives, they were considered the best in the biz. They had the technology, they had the resources, and they listened to their customers, who at the time were mainly these big mainframe computer manufacturers.
So far, so good, right? Give the people what they want.
Right. But here's where things get interesting. Along comes this new technology, the 5.25-inch drive. Now, initially, everyone kind of scoffed at it. I mean, it was tiny, completely inadequate for the needs of those big mainframe users. But what those established companies failed to see was that this smaller, cheaper drive was exactly what a new breed of computer needed, the desktop PC.
Oh, wow. So they were so focused on making the best 14-inch drive, they missed a whole other market emerging.
Precisely. And that right there is a classic example of the innovator's dilemma in action.
So we've got these companies, they're at the top of their game, laser focused on what they do best.
Sounds like a recipe for success, right?
You'd think so, wouldn't you? But as we're learning, that intense focus can actually create a blind spot. It's like they're so busy looking in the rearview mirror, admiring their past successes, that they miss what's coming up fast on the horizon.
And that brings us to the heart of why good companies fail. It's not about bad luck or even incompetent leadership, at least not in the traditional sense.
Right. The innovator's dilemma lays out 5 key principles at play. And the first one is this idea of resource dependence. Essentially, companies are beholden to their customers, their investors, those who provide the resources they need to survive and grow.
Makes sense. You need customers to buy your product and investors to, well, invest. Exactly. But here's the thing. Those with the loudest voices, they tend to get the most attention. So if your biggest customers are all clamoring for incremental improvements, more of the same, but a little bit better, well, naturally, that's where you're going to focus your energy.
Even if there's a smaller, quieter group out there who are starting to demand something totally different, something that disrupts the status quo.
Exactly. And that takes us to the second principle. Small markets, big problem.
Okay, so break that down for us. Small markets, big problem.
The book argues that large, well-established companies often need massive growth to keep their investors happy, right? Wall Street loves a good growth story. So these tiny emerging markets, they often get dismissed, even ridiculed, because they just don't move the needle.
Even if those small markets represent the future.
It's the innovator's dilemma in a nutshell. They're so busy catering to their existing customers, those demanding incremental improvements, that they miss out on entirely new markets emerging.
It's like Blockbuster laughing off Netflix back in the day, right? Who wants to wait for a DVD to arrive in the mail?
Exactly. Or remember that tiny 5.25-inch disk drive we talked about? Initially, it seemed insignificant, almost a novelty, but it was the perfect solution for a market that was just starting to emerge, the desktop PC market. And by the time those big players realized what was happening, it was often too late to catch up.
They were stuck in the old paradigm, blindsided by a technology they didn't even see coming.
And that brings us to principle 3, the deception of forecasts. Traditional market research surveys, focus groups, all that, it's notoriously bad at predicting disruptive technologies because the needs they meet are often latent, the applications are unclear, and the potential for growth is completely underestimated.
It's like trying to predict the weather 10 years from now, right? Way too many variables, too much uncertainty,
Exactly. So you can't always research your way to innovation. Sometimes you have to trust your gut, take a calculated risk, and be willing to experiment.
which is, I imagine, a tough sell in those big bureaucratic organizations.
Oh, absolutely.
Mm.
And that leads us to principle 4. Capabilities can become disabilities. What a company is good at can actually turn into a weakness when faced with disruptive change.
Wait, so the very processes and values that made them successful can become roadblocks.
Precisely. The book gives the example of those massive steel mills. Those operations were designed for high-volume, high-margin production. But when mini mills came along, able to produce smaller batches of cheaper steel, the big mills, they struggled to pivot. Their entire system, their workforce, their mindset, everything was built for a different game. Their strength became their weakness.
Wow, that's a powerful image, that strength becoming a weakness. Okay, so we've covered 4 principles so far, all pretty sobering. What's number 5?
Principle 5 is overshooting the market, and this one really gets at the heart of how customer needs can be both a guide and a distraction.
Overshooting the market. Okay, yeah, that one definitely rings a bell. It seems like we see that happening all the time, even in our own lives.
All the time. And it's particularly relevant when we're talking about technology. Basically, what it means is that technology often advances at a much faster pace than what customers actually need or want at that moment.
So you end up with all these products, they're packed with features, they're incredibly sophisticated, but in a way that just adds layers of complexity without really making things better for the user.
Exactly. And that gap between what's technologically possible and what people actually need or want, it creates an opening, a vulnerability.
So a simpler, cheaper solution comes along, something that might have even been seen as inferior or behind the times just a few years earlier, and boom, it disrupts the whole market. Like, just imagine for a second, what if someone came out with a smartphone today that just did a few things really well? Calls, texts, maybe a couple essential apps, but it was way cheaper and the battery lasted for days. People might flock to that, even if it wasn't as advanced as the latest model with a zillion features they don't even use.
You're exactly right. And, what I appreciate about the innovator's dilemma is that it doesn't just point out the problem, it also offers solutions. It gives companies a roadmap for navigating this tricky terrain.
Okay, so how do companies avoid becoming another cautionary tale, the next Blockbuster or Kodak? How do they ditch the blinders and embrace the kind of disruptive innovation that keeps them ahead of the curve?
Well, one of the key takeaways, and this might seem counterintuitive at first, is that companies need to be willing to look beyond their best and most loyal customers.
Oh, interesting. So don't just listen to the people who are already buying your product, but actively seek out the ones who aren't.
Exactly. Seek out the wrong customers.
The ones who are finding workarounds, maybe even cobbling together their own solutions because what's currently on the market just doesn't cut it.
You got it. Those are often your early adopters, the ones who can give you a glimpse into the future. They can point you towards those unmet needs, those emerging trends that might seem small or insignificant now, but could explode into major markets down the road.
It reminds me of that quote, "The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone." Sometimes the most valuable insights come from the most unexpected places.
Love that. And another thing companies can do, and this is so crucial, is to create independent teams. Give them the freedom, the resources to operate outside the usual corporate structure.
Give them some breathing room. Let them be scrappy and experimental.
Exactly. Because if you try to force disruptive innovation into existing frameworks, it's often dead on arrival. Too much bureaucracy, too much risk aversion.
So create those skunk works, those agile teams that can move fast, experiment, even fail without derailing the whole enterprise.
Absolutely. And finally, and this is something the innovator's dilemma really emphasizes, is the importance of what it calls discovery-driven planning.
Discovery-driven planning. So not just sticking to a rigid plan, but being willing to adapt and evolve as you go.
You nailed it. Because with disruptive technology, so much of the path reveals itself as you explore, not before.
It's less about predicting the future and more about constantly exploring, experimenting, adapting, even stumbling a bit along the way.
Precisely. Because in the world of disruptive innovation, the only constant is change.
Wow. This deep dive into the innovator's dilemma has been honestly a little mind-blowing. It really challenges you to think differently about what it means to be a good company and how even the smartest people with the best intentions can still miss the forest for the trees.
Absolutely. It's a reminder that success can be a double-edged sword, that the very things that got you to the top can hold you back if you're not careful.
So true. Any final thoughts for our listeners before we wrap things up?
I guess I would just leave people with this. The principles we've discussed today, they're not just for Fortune 500 companies. They apply to all of us, no matter what we do, what we're passionate about. The world is changing at a breakneck pace, and the only way to navigate that change successfully is to stay curious, stay adaptable, and never, ever be afraid to disrupt yourself.
Couldn't have said it better myself. That's it for this week's deep dive into the innovator's dilemma. We'll catch you next time for another fascinating journey into the world of ideas. Until then, keep those brains buzzing.